This is Joe Dancy with the University of Oklahoma College of Law. I'm the executive director of their Energy Center.
Thank you for joining us today, a regular here on the program. And yesterday we had Josh Robbins on, Beechwood Marketing. He gave us an update from NAPE. Today we've got Joe Dancy on, so he can give us a update, and then I'll ask you a few of the observations that Josh saw as well, and see how we kind of go from there, get a multi-layered perspective of NAPE this year. So how you doing?
Hey, really good. It was a great Houston conference. We had a good time. The first thing I noticed, Jason, was in the last 3 years, every year it seems like you get a few more people, a few more booths, and seemed to be a lot more people this year. They had 12,000. I think last year they had 11. The year before, 10,000 and a number. And there seemed to be a lot more booths. And I tell you why I know that, because they pretty much extended the entire convention center. There was some room on the end for a few additions, but I truck my mileage just walking back and forth from our booth to other booths, and I put on probably close to 6 miles just going up and down and talking to people and et cetera, tromping around the over 2 days and tromping around the convention center. So and it seemed like most people were probably more interactive in the past, walking past some booths. And of course, I work for University of Oklahoma, so I'm not there buying. I'm not there really selling. We had a booth for our student society and for our online program, but generally I like to just talk to people. But if they're negotiating or talking to, it looks like real business, I don't want to step in and interrupt a transaction, and so there were a number of folks I wanted to talk to. I really didn't get a chance to, but the number that I did, most of them were pretty optimistic. And at the end, just the few booths around us, I went over and they were selling prospects in Texas and elsewhere, and asked them, what do you think of this year's conference? And they said, God, we got much more response than we thought there'd be. And so that was sort of the consensus. It was a good program. I will tell you, there were a few booths with some North Dakota acreage, one of which I didn't wanted to talk to them, but I didn't get a chance to do that because they had a crowd in front of their group. But in the morning I went by and I looked at their geological. They had a bunch of geological maps and stuff on it. It looked pretty interesting. Of course, it was an oil prospect, and mainly, Jason, it's still, your prospects are mainly oil-based still. It's tough to make money on natural gas at $2.70 or whatever it's selling for now, and the consensus seems to be we got plenty of natural gas, and even with natural gas liquids, the economics just aren't quite as attractive as oil shows, which is correct. It seemed to be a lot of Louisiana, a lot of Texas plays, a number of Oklahoma. It was pretty geographically mixed this year. And one of the things that I found, and every year I go, it seems to be more and more companies selling software, technology, tracking, just data stuff. And I don't know whether that's a trend or whether I do know, apparently, all this software and technology and big data analysis, it must be profitable and there must be some interesting niches. I'm not the brightest bulb in the world when it comes to technology with regard to, some of what was being sold, but it was sort of interesting to see. And past that, the reception seemed to be well attended. I went to the Haynes and Boone reception, which is I've worked with their energy attorneys now for about 20 or 25 years doing educational programs, and we took and it's pretty interesting, we have a virtual reality shot of the Permian Basin as well as the Santa Rita #1 discovery well in the Permian Basin, which is a discovery well for the Permian Basin. And you put the virtual reality headset on and you can fly over these areas, and you actually can look up and down. It's like you are in a helicopter. And it was probably the most impressive booth presentation by any educational institution in the history of NAPE. And part of the reason is that's a big bragging, but the part of the reason is most educational institutions. I mean, you'd stop by and, gee, here's our booklet on our program. Here's a pin. Here's an alumni sticker. And we actually, when you sit down and you actually have a interaction with the students and interaction with the computer program, and you actually learn something because there's a narration explaining, what's going on. It worked pretty well. So overall, it was a good program. I guess one of the things that came up, and this has come up before, is water's an issue, especially in Texas, West Texas, and New Mexico for fracking, and because the amount of water needed is substantial. Sand seems to be less of an issue because, a bunch of local sand mines apparently have opened up in Texas, Oklahoma. I don't know about New Mexico, but you don't have quite the backlog getting all that stuff down from Wisconsin.
Man, that's really turned into a competitive market, isn't it?
Yeah, boy, I'm glad I'm not in that business. It looked really attractive for a while, and it's like, geez, look how, because they're using so much of it. And actually it is interesting here in Oklahoma City or Norman, Oklahoma. I drive on I-35 quite a bit, and it is shocking how many trucks are full of sand that are running. We have a couple mines just down by Ada, which is southeast Oklahoma, sand mines that have been actually mined for 100 years, Jason. And it's interesting. And I talked to the manager. He's actually going to come visit my class here in about a month. But he said, originally with the fracking, he goes, we were not one of the preferred providers because of the size of our sand was too fine. It was like a 100 mesh, I think, or smaller. And he goes, as it turns out, as time has gone on, the demand for that size mesh has gone way up. And so I asked him, roughly, I was just curious how much that sand was worth in these trucks. And so we figured it out. It's about $1,000 a truckload is what they're delivering. And for each well, I didn't ask how many trucks, but I would guarantee you there'd probably be at least 100 truckloads of sand for most of these, mile long or mile and a half long laterals, just based on just rough back of the envelope calculations. So that was pretty cool. And I guess lastly,
I was gonna mention one other industry that seems to be pretty competitive, and I wanted to ask you if it was seen that way down at NAPE, is the environmental services. Anything to do with cleanup or some environmental solutions, that sort of thing, is a big wave in the last few years. Has seemed to be pretty competitive too, because everybody's got their own proprietary chemical type, solution. And so everybody's bragging about why theirs is better than everybody else's. Was that it all at NAPE this year?
Well, there were a number of environmental folks. I talked to them a little bit. Of course, I teach, a little bit oil and gas environmental law, and talk a little bit about cleanup and technology. And like you say, though, the technology it is interesting, both the cleanup of oil spills and of saltwater spills. I mean, the technology is getting better and better, as well as just the, when you revegetate, especially salt damaged lands or oil damaged lands, the expertise is getting better. And I don't know whether it's genetics or whether it's the seeds or whatever, but if you look, and this is a story they tell. Now, whether this is really the case in the field, Lord knows, Jason. But they tell us, it's easier now with the current technology to, revegetate and reclaim a oil site than it has been historically, and also the fact that with these laterals, instead of drilling 5 wells, you're only drilling 1, and
right.
So your pad is much smaller, your reclamation area is much smaller. The surface owner supposedly is happier because he doesn't have to take his tractor around 5 different pump jacks. But anyway,
I tell you, I'm a huge fan of rig mats. These mats you lay down before you start the drilling process. We did quite a bit with Montana Rig Mat. Nice company, Kalispell area, Montana, ship all over the world. And he got me to really understand the reason behind the significance of these rig mats. And there's a bunch of different companies. But when you lay them down, the floral comes back. So your your restoration project is you got your native floral coming back. You don't have to go find those plants again. You don't have to do all those different things. So to me, I look at something as simple as that. Putting down some boards basically, just when you're done, take them out. And of course, if there's any spills or anything like that, it catches them as well. So that's just one example I wanted to throw in there with what you were talking about. Some of the advancements. Sometimes when we think of innovation, it's all got to be, blips and computers. And sometimes,
Right.
The wheel is still a pretty innovative tool.
Well, it's interesting with rig mats. It's interesting you mentioned that because years ago, whenever you were in sort of a marshy area or a swamp or, you needed a wetlands permit, a lot of times the wetlands permit or the landowner or the regulatory agency would require you to use those, man. And like you say, the great thing is if you're over a sort of a marshy area that will support machinery, you throw those things down there, and literally you're not digging up the marsh. And when you're done, you pull it up, and Lord knows, like you say, they revegetate itself because you haven't messed up the soil, the chemistry, the seeds, and everything else. So it's a pretty cool technology. And I didn't see. And again, I really didn't talk to many environmental, but they were there. There were a number of booths dealing with remediation.
Joe Dancy's our guest, University of Oklahoma. He's executive director over at the Energy Center there. University of Oklahoma Law. I have to make sure I clarify that. Because that is different than University of Oklahoma. You guys are a satellite campus?
No, well, actually, we're right on campus. We're just on the south part of campus. And everybody is sort of, OU is such a big energy
I love it.
Campus. I mean,
love Oklahoma.
We had our first. We were the first geology school nationwide. Opened up, I think, 1901, 1902. Professor Gould. There's a Gould geology building. Now it's actually a Gould archaeology or Gould architect building. They renamed it and gave our geologists a new program. We were the first petroleum engineering program. Of course, we were the first petroleum landman program, and of course, over at the law school, I don't think we were the first, but we've been one of the longest energy law programs around. So there's a lot of history here, which sort of makes it exciting for me to be around. So in any event,
I was going to say, I love Oklahoma. I've got some great memories in Oklahoma and a lot of toll booth memories too, but that's a different story. My favorite memory of Oklahoma, I used to be a baseball player and played the AAU tournaments, and we were down in Oklahoma one year, and the state of North Dakota All-Stars I was on, and we'd travel and play the different teams, that sort of thing. And the second day of the tournament, we ended up playing the Oklahoma All-Stars. The first night we lost 8-0. The next night we played Wisconsin, and they had a 6'7" pitcher, a pitcher that was 6'7". Okay, we're 16 years old. Okay, so
wow.
Exactly. He ended up going to the pros, but he pitched a one-hitter against us, and I got the hit because the ball was coming right for my head, and I tried to move to get out of the way, and it hit the bat, and I outran it. So I got our one hit. Otherwise, that guy would have pitched a no-hitter against us. That's my favorite memory of Oklahoma. Anyway, but so okay. How about the money side of things? Were there any merger acquisition rumblings? Was there any sort of capital cap talk? You know what I mean? Just talk turkey a little bit with me. What'd you overhear?
Yeah, well, what I sort of overheard, and it was sort of interesting, just asking about the financing and the private equity and the private capital and the public capital, and talking to a number of folks. The public companies with oil and gas, they have done relatively poorly because the outlook for oil and gas here in the futures curve. So for a lot of companies, the exit strategy of build a nice little field of 10 or 20 wells and 100 drilling locations and sell it to a public company, that hasn't worked real well, and at least lately. And talking to some people, they say until oil prices get up much above $50 or $55 a barrel, you're probably not going to see a lot of activity. Natural gas is sort of like oh, your crazy cousin. They don't know. Nobody really wants to deal with natural gas because they don't think you can make money at, 275 or 250, and they think there's so much of it that all you have to do is, stick a straw in the ground.
Yeah.
It was sort of interesting. The feedback. I talked to some lease brokers in different areas, and they said, there is so much money flowing into the sector that it is a little bit concerning about some of these lease prices, especially in the Permian Basin. That when you roll out the prices you're paying for leases now, it makes the economic returns a lot more modest than they would have been otherwise, and I guess that's bad for the investors. But on the other hand, if you're a mineral owner, or if you're a company with some leasehold, that's not all that bad. But so that was sort of some of the feedback on the financial end of things. I was sort of asking around, gee, what do you guys? Are you optimistic? What are you basing your capital expenditures on? And oh, gee, Jason, the feedback I got is, the price of oil and the price of gas is, no one seems to be able to predict it. It's so cyclical. It's so volatile. You got everybody trading futures these days. It's really difficult for folks to plan, which is bad for, number one, it's bad for, your manpower. You don't know, it's bad for contracting for your rigs and completion crews. And let me stop right there. Another point that came up was in the Permian, as they get these pipelines connected here, probably by year end, to get all the oil and natural gas out of the Permian, they said there's a whole bunch of drilled and uncompleted wells, and everybody's going to want to, as soon as they see that pipeline capacity, they're going to run and want to complete their wells. And they said there's going to be a huge shortage of completion crews that are competent, and it'll be some people think that'll be a frenzy of activity. Because there aren't going to be enough people, but actually the completion operations for the most part have actually reduced the size of their crews because they don't have enough work, because everybody isn't completing. They're just drilling. You don't complete a well if you don't have a pipeline to sell it into. So when they start up again, they don't think there's going to be enough people. There's not enough people in Midland. Midland's going about 100 miles an hour right now, so you can't go a heck of a lot faster.
Sure.
They say it's going to be sort of exciting to see. It might be a big bottleneck. It might be.
It's going to be a definite tweak. You're going to see a tweak, because this is what's interesting. What's going on right now, in my opinion, what I'm hearing a lot of is this is remnants of that time before the downturn. And so people are not sure if they want to save money in order to make money, or if they want to spend money in order to make money. And so that's the uncertainty in the marketplace, obviously. People are optimistic. Things are looking good. All projections point that way. But people are a little bit scared because of the last downturn, because that same feeling, that same energy was there before it went to what do we have, about a year and a half, 2 years of a downturn, was it?
Right.
And that slows things down. Up in the Bakken, they were still putting out 1 million barrels a day. So I mean, some people are still pumping out oil, but I see where the ripple into the completion crews could be an issue when the kind of the boomerang effect happens on a few things. What was the one thing I wanted to ask you about was, and you kind of mentioned it with the completion crews, and kind of in some of our bantering emails back and forth, I noticed that the word poached engineers, and I wanted to ask you about that, because back in the early days, at least in the Bakken, there was such a demand for pipe fitters, electricians, basically pipe fitters and electricians, plumbers, electricians, and pipe fitters. But the electricians, they were having a hard time even going out to dinner, because they would get hired going out to dinner. Someone would just steal them, right? I'm serious. And so the companies in Fargo on the east side of the state, they stopped sending workers out to western North Dakota because they wouldn't come back. And because there's such a shortage of them, the company would have to hire that person back when the downturn came, because everybody needs electricians. And so we kind of joke that they were demigods out in the Bakken because there was such a shortage of them. And so that's what that poached engineer kind of back and forth reminded me of is what's going on with the engineers, because I think it's kind of, is there a shortage of them? Are they so sought after? Or just kind of talk to me about that.
Well, I had lunch with, I just sat at a table at random at lunch the first day, and the people were talking there, and I won't mention the company they're with, but they noted a number of companies were afraid to send any of their technical staff, including their engineers that had any experience, because what would happen is a competitor would go up and if you're an engineer who have worked just a given area for 10 years, and you can go up and talk to them. You essentially are doing an interview, although the party that's talking to you doesn't know they're being interviewed. And hell, if you like the person, it's like, geez, how would you like to come work for XYZ Corporation? We'll give you a hell of a raise. And so they were talking that some of these firms, and I guess this is from last year, but also this year, they were afraid to bring some of their more senior technical folks because of the, including engineers, geologists, geophysicists, what have you, because they would be poached by competitors. And then I talked to a few other people, and they said that's not uncommon, even past the engineer to the landman and even to the attorney standpoint, where people are being quote poached, which I think is not all that bad. I mean, it's one of those deals that just means if you have a certain skill set that you've developed, I mean, as you know, it's so cyclical here. If you can, make a good living and get a good, good raise, fantastic. Although I can understand a company, just the efficiency when you have people coming in and out of the door, it does tend to make things much more inefficient and create, certain issues. But it was interesting to see, and I got a good chuckle out of it. And it was totally, of course, my deal when they came up. I said, my guess, if you told me people didn't want to bring their senior people, is the reason they didn't want to bring them is because they probably go to the receptions, drink too much, and spill all the technical beans to the competitors. I said, no, that's not the problem. The problem is these folks go to the reception and then they don't come back to our table. They're hired by someone else down on the next row, and I had to laugh. It was pretty funny.
Well, in the early days in the Bakken, I mean, they were doubling the salaries. I mean, they were just flat out. I mean, and how could you refuse it? You're an electrician, you're making a good wage, and you're supporting your family, and all of a sudden, we'll double your salary for the next 2 years. Man, that's life changing. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Then of course it's completely changing to the company involved, and you hate to blame anybody, or you hate to, point fingers, because everybody's trying to probably do what's best for their families at the end of the day. But man, what a real sticky situation to be in,
Yeah, well, and unfortunately for the industry, it's not all that good. Of course, every industry, I grew up in the Detroit area, and of course the auto industry is just the same way. They're either hiring left and right, or they're laying off, and you go work for them. And it's and I guess the key to all this, Jason, I mean, I've thought about it. I'm getting older now, but I mean, really, whatever you do, you need to continue to develop your skill set, something you find interested in, whether you're an electrician, whether you're a plumber, whether you're an engineer, geologist, attorney, landman, just because things are so cyclical. You need to have a backup that, when the oil bust comes, then, you can work on water, or you can work on environmental remediation, or you can, go to a different, go to work for the plastics or the refiners or the world. But, and of course that's life. It's, when you're younger, you're always just, I mean, I was petrified that, they're having cutbacks, and I'll be one of the, what am I going to do if I get laid off? And in the end, it almost always works out. You find something, and even if it's not your first choice, you develop a separate skill set, and you go out and you're better for it. And it's but it's not comfortable, obviously, when you're in that situation. Of course, now we're in the boom time. Now's the fun time. The bad time will be, in the next bust, when it's not like, poaching electricians. It's like, we got 4 electricians, we only need 2. Who are we gonna get rid of? So anyway,
Joe Dancy, University of Oklahoma at Law, with us. He's the executive director at the Energy Center, talking a little bit about NAPE, some of the things that happened at this year's conference, setting the tone, checking out the themes for the energy industry this year. And just a couple questions left. I wanted to ask you about the students have the podcast going, Alex Epstein in your class. And the other thing, but I quickly wanted to ask you before we got to that was, hang on here, let me see. See, I can't be writing these things down. Drug testing. Was there much of drug testing in NAPE this year? The reason I ask is I can't remember if it was you or if it was someone else mentioned how some oil companies were starting, or some oil and construction companies were starting to have chief drug officers because of this increase of opioids and other drugs, these.
Oh, that's a fantastic question. I didn't see any boost, promoting drug testing or chief, and I didn't hear, but I have heard from the great. Obviously, when you're running, whether you're driving a truck, whether you're running equipment, it's incredibly potentially dangerous. So you need to make sure your people, just from a standpoint, both the regulatory and personnel and safety standpoint, make sure they are not involved with illicit substances. And so, most companies have a type of drug protocol, and even and actually I've corresponded with, and I forget, she's out in Midland, who was, we just connected on LinkedIn about 6 months ago, and I just asked her, your chief, drug officer for this relatively big size driller, and she said, she goes, there are issues out, and obviously there are issues in any industry, and it is interesting to see. I will tell you what's interesting in Oklahoma, specifically in the scoop and stack, and I don't know in North Dakota, but they've actually sort of legalized marijuana here for medical purposes. And one of the problems the companies are having now is, historically, they always given you a drug test and say, you either pass or fail, and if you fail, I don't know whether you're terminated or go through rehabilitation, or whether they have some program. There's a protocol. Mm-hmm. So now with the new marijuana, legislative, you have the right as an individual to use marijuana for, stress, whatever. The companies are having to relook, because they really can't fire people because it's legal to use marijuana in Oklahoma, at least on the state level. Now on the federal level, Lord knows, but I don't know what the legal answer is, but I know some of the firms here in the scoop and stack are wrestling with it, and they said
it's going to get challenged. It's going to get challenged.
Well, the last thing you need, and even if they're using the marijuana for legit, which if they have a prescription, I assume it's legit. If there's an accident and someone's hurt, the first thing the party who's hurt's going to say is, "Gee, you were negligent, company, because you let this person drive a truck when clearly they should not have been behind the wheel." And I don't know enough. I'm not enough of an employment attorney to or actually informed about all this stuff, and to looked at it. But it's an interesting issue, and it is a problem, and
it's a real issue. You're talking about Colorado. There's the Niobrara's in Colorado, and there's a number of companies out of Denver. And so you're talking about full-on recreational there. That goes beyond the medicinal part. So the medicinal part will get challenged, like you mentioned earlier, with it, just like a prescription drugs, whatever it is. At some point, somebody's going to say, my Pineapple Express and my bong is a prescription. And they'll probably be right. They'll probably win on that. Who knows? I'm not sure. It's some of the rec ones, and it's some of just how it stays in your system for 30 days, and a number of those different things that I think that these drug officers, these chief drug officers, got their work cut out for them. I think they're going to be working hand in hand with attorneys trying to figure out how to walk some of these legal landmines that could be potentially there, because oil and gas pays very well. And it's not a lot to ask to not do drugs while you're working. And some people are going to challenge that, unfortunately. Do you know what I mean? I don't know how else to phrase it. I mean, Anyway, but so okay, there wasn't anything really public at NAPE about that yet, but the rumblings are still happening, is what we're getting at.
Yes, rumblings are still happening. Now that you say that, boy, that would be a real interesting. And of course, they probably don't need to advertise.
No.
Probably the demand for their, but if they had a booth, I guarantee you that would have been an interesting discussion. So.
Or even a panel discussion
Yep.
one year, or something like that. Maybe over a lunch, or just some of the trends and things to look for. Some of the things that other companies are trying and doing, etc.
Right.
Okay, well, let's get past the drug talk here. Let's go to the podcast, the University of Oklahoma Energy Student Podcast, and you also had Alex Epstein in your class. So let's kind of talk a little bit about that as we conclude here.
Yeah, well, actually, Alex Skyped in or Zoomed into our class yesterday. Of course, he wrote The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. He's the best-selling New York Times author. And one reason, Jason, I wanted him to come to the class is, I have 69 students in my class. 2 years ago, when I first started teaching, there was 11 students in the prior professor. And the reason they like my class is I'm objective. I bring in people like Alex. And most of these students don't know anything. This is their first exposure. This is the survey course for energy. So I want to give them a view, because you hear so often, especially among the younger set, that, if you're promoting oil and gas, it's like you're promoting tobacco, or you're promoting something that is incredibly evil for you or cancerous or something. And to hear someone like Alex Epstein with his book, and he's revising, he's going to have a new book out here in the near future, but essentially talk about what energy has done for us as far as our living standards, as far as our health, our environment is cleaner. And actually, it is interesting, because I didn't bring it up yesterday, but at the beginning of the semester, our environmental society, they played this tape, and essentially it was a parody, and they had people singing Oklahoma, but they were talking about, how the land's getting dirtier and the water's getting more polluted in the air. But in reality, if you go back, our air and our water is much, much cleaner now than it was 50 years ago. And actually, if you go back 100 years, you go in London, and it was, the main rivers were, major cesspools, as well as in the United States, where you just dump your sewage in. So not only is it disgustingly dirty, but it's also a health hazard. And he just explained to the students, it was sort of an interactive give and take. And hopefully we had a little bit of technical difficulties, but hopefully we got it recorded. So I was going to post it on LinkedIn later if we got a good cut, and as well as on our podcast. But hopefully, the students will walk away and say, geez, energy, this is not that bad of an area to consider being a career. He also noted, and I specifically came back to talk to him about, you hear everybody now, the young generation especially, it's like oil is bad, wind turbines and solar are good. And Alex took about 10 minutes talking about why wind turbines and solar are not all that good. Is because, number one, they're intermittent, they're not quite all reliable, you need a backup source. Of course, you get up to North Dakota or Minnesota, and they get iced in, they get snowed in. When it got to below -20, those wind turbines automatically turn off. So all of a sudden you have a huge demand on natural gas. And apparently Minnesota and Michigan, both, number of utilities had to tell their customers, turn down your heat, because the problem is they didn't have enough natural gas to fuel both, the backup generators to generate electricity as well as the heat. So there's some policy issue there that are going to have to be addressed, in the near future. So that was sort of interesting. It was a very interesting, hour-long conversation with Alex, and he's quite an interesting guy. If you've listened to some of his tapes, he's very interesting.
I'm not sold on wind myself here. I think that's moving too fast for what is still out there for valid questions.
Right.
And yeah, so that's interesting to hear other people's take on it as well,
Well, part of it's just the energy density. You look at and I've done the numbers. We have a number of, Oklahoma's number 2, Texas is number 1, wind-wise. Iowa, there's sort of a wind belt that goes up there. And Part of the problem is just the energy density, versus having a small coal plant or small natural gas plant. You need, thousands of square acres of land to put up these wind turbines. And actually, Jason, I've sort of become, when I first came up, I really thought they were annoying and disgusting to look at, like a radio antenna. But the more I look at them, the more I sort of don't mind them. But a lot of people do, and that I understand totally. When you put a wind farm up, you're not just putting up one wind turbine; you're putting up, a small one and have 50, and more so, you're looking at 50 to 100 to 200 wind turbines that are spaced so that they don't interfere with each other. And obviously you stick them under a few 400 feet in the air. So, I mean, you can see them for 10 miles away at least. And it's, there's some real interesting, as well as just the jumping from into the grid and out of the grid with your intermittent power sources. I've heard it makes managing the grid much more difficult to make it stable, and that's the big goal. Is you want to have a stable grid with reasonable prices. Is what the regulators want. Price is not the ultimate driver. They want it to be stable, and wind and solar are making it a little bit. It's like riding a bicycle on your, putting a couple bowling balls on each arm and trying to stay straight. So it's not all that easy.
You said it right with the bicycle, which is wind and solar work pretty good for personal use type things and for small usage and maybe if they've got a wind turbine you can put on your house, you could probably assist with some energy and solar. You can probably charge your batteries and things like that. And there's a place for them, but they're going to replace oil and gas. That's just nonsense talk right now. I mean, I was just having this talk with someone yesterday about we don't bring anybody on we only talk experts on this program. You know that. In fact,
right.
Just to give the listeners some evidence behind that, go back and listen to the interview with Joe Dancy from a few months ago, and we're talking about the potentials of the natural gas shortages that we just talked about, that the wind energy people said you got to cut back, otherwise we're going to have natural gas shortages. So
right.
we do know what we're talking about here, and we do prognosticate quite a bit as well. And these wind energy things, until they can figure out a way to make it a little bit more economical and a little bit, like you said, density-wise. But the whole idea of getting rid of oil, fossil fuels is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, to me, that's actually talking to a crazy person, because the world is so reliant on fossil fuels that I don't even know how a 20% reduction could be done over 10 years. Do you know what I mean?
And that's Alex's story, and actually, he points out, a third of the world, actually has zero energy. So if you're going to cut out fossil fuels, I mean, you're giving them zero hope to ever have, a car, refrigerator, heater. They're heating their abode with wood or cow dung or something, and living very unsanitary conditions, mainly because they don't have energy to clean the water, to clean the air, to get them in the hospital and to the doctor's office. And he goes, so if when you hear these climate, the climate fanatics, I guess I would use the word, that want to shut down all oil and gas production, what they're saying philosophically wise, and Alex is very good at this. He just philosophically goes, what they're saying is, a lot of you will never have, you never have the riches, you'll never have the wealth, you'll never have the lifespan that, someone in the United States would have, because they have so much energy to utilize. And it's a good argument. You can't say, geez, let's just let those, 3 billion people, let's just keep them, in the dark and cold. You can say that, but if that's your philosophy, Alex says, clearly you are not for human betterment. You have some other agenda, and he says it so well. I mean, if you have not read The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, and I know you have, but if our listeners haven't, it's a book, and actually some of the charts in there are probably some of the best charts you can just look at the pictures, those charts, and you'll see the story. And even for me, and I've been in the industry, for 30 or 40 years now, when I first bought his book, it's only been out 4 years. I looked at the charts and they were stunning. And actually I copied it and I use a lot of them in my classes and say, hey, this illustrates, our environment's getting cleaner. This illustrates, lifespan and oil use correlates closely whether you're in India, China, or the United States or elsewhere. So anyway, it's exciting, Jason.
Yeah, and for me, this person I was talking to the other day where, we got to get rid of fossil fuels, they said, well, I'll tell you what, buddy, why don't you come on over here because you're talking to me on your cell phone. I mean, you can't even make it up. Yeah, I mean, it's just like, and I told him, I said, listen, if you want to have a discussion about maybe figuring out a new way for soft drinks to come, in different packages so those plastic rings aren't there, or maybe making plastic bottles go away and the old aluminum glass bottle cans type things come back. Well, that's a start, okay? And I'm sure the oil and gas industry would be all about that because they'll figure out just a new heavier duty or plastic that'll work in the ag industry or work in the other industries. I said, but I get that's a discussion, but you guys don't want to have that. You just want to get rid of it all. Just be done with it and have the only industry that's gained employment for the last 10 years is that's a stat, by the way, that I think is underreported. The only industry that has had a net gain of jobs in the last 10 years, the oil and gas industry. That's it. Mining. Yeah, all this, technology and innovation and all these other things that we've had come and go over the last 10 years, none of them have sustained. Oil and gas has. That to me speaks a lot too. And when you think about how much of innovation is right now directed by oil and gas, it's incredible too. I mean, all that is due to hydraulic fracturing. So, all right, let's wrap up here. I see my, I've got to look at the clock here. We're getting close to that time. So, give yourself a plug on how people can get in touch with you, and you guys can make some money as either sponsors or alumni or whatever they have. You're kind of a think tank, guys, so it's a little different.
If you're interested, if you are interested in further, actually in the energy sector, online programs, University of Oklahoma has an excellent online master's in legal studies program. You don't become a lawyer, but you, over 15 months, will teach you a lot about oil and gas leasing, property law, water law, etc. You do it all online. It's a pretty neat deal. But past that, if you want to get in contact with me, it's I'm on LinkedIn. You can connect or just send me an email through my email address. It's online too on the LinkedIn profile, and I'd be happy to correspond. It is exciting, Jason. There's a lot of people in the energy sector, and as you note, the technology, the opportunities, the capital, the wealth that's being created, it's not appreciated. It's appreciated more now than maybe it was 4 or 5 years ago. But as people become aware of what's happening with oil and gas and how much we actually have here in the United States, it's sort of stunning to see how dynamic the industry is. So thanks for having me on, Jason.